In 1907, in a home for destitute women in Washington, D.C., an elderly woman died with almost nothing to her name, except a few personal belongings connecting her to the family of the President of the United States. She had been born into slavery in Virginia in 1818, at the absolute bottom of a system that legally classified her as property. By the time Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, she was one of only a handful of people his widow trusted completely. Closer to Mary Todd Lincoln, in her darkest hours, than almost anyone else alive. And then, 3 years later, she published a memoir that Lincoln's own son spent years trying to make sure the world would forget. This is the story of Elizabeth Keckley. These are the stories the history books forgot. If that matters to you, we're aiming to hit 1,000 subscribers before the month ends, and every subscriber makes the next story happen. Hit the subscribe button, and don't miss what's coming next. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every one. I want to know. Elizabeth Keckley was born enslaved in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, in February 1818. Her mother, Agnes, was enslaved by the Burwell family. Elizabeth's early life followed the routine cruelty of the system she was born into. Assigned to domestic labor from childhood, moved among households as her enslaver's circumstances required, subject at any time to violence or sale without any legal recourse of her own. She was later sent to live with a relative of the Burwell family in North Carolina, where she endured years of physical abuse. She gave birth to a son, George, conceived after an assault by a white man in that household, a fact she would later document herself, plainly and without embellishment, in her own writing. This was not incidental cruelty. It was the ordinary operation of the system she lived inside. Her body, her labor, and her child were, under the law of the time, someone else's property. But inside that system, Elizabeth discovered something the law could not regulate: an extraordinary talent for sewing. She had learned dressmaking as a domestic skill, but what she developed went well beyond what was typically expected of an enslaved seamstress. Her needlework was precise, inventive, and increasingly sought after, not just by the household that owned her, but eventually by other wealthy white families in the community who were willing to pay for her services. That skill would become, quite literally, the only leverage she had over her own future. By the 1850s, Elizabeth had been relocated to St. Louis with the Garland family, who now legally owned her. It was there, working under grinding financial pressure, that she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She resolved to purchase her own freedom. The negotiation, when it came, was framed by her enslavers with the cold transactional logic that defined the entire institution. A price was set: $1,200, an enormous sum, equivalent to years of a working person's income in that era, for the legal right to own herself. She had witnessed over decades exactly how the system measured a human being's worth, in dollars set by someone else, for a person who had no say in the number. Now she had to raise that number herself, one commissioned dress at a time. Elizabeth Keckley did not raise $1,200 through anyone's charity. She raised it through the same skill that had first distinguished her: sewing, at a volume and quality that made her indispensable to the wealthy women of St. Louis society. She worked constantly. She took on client after client, building a reputation as a dressmaker whose work justified premium prices, even though she herself was enslaved, and had no legal right to the money she earned beyond what her enslaver permitted her to keep. The math was ruthless and specific. $1,200, accumulated in small increments, dependent entirely on continued demand for her work and the cooperation of people who had no obligation to help her. She found that help anyway, not from the system, but from a network of sympathetic clients in St. Louis, several of whom eventually loaned her the remaining funds she needed to complete the purchase. In 1855, after years of labor and negotiation, Elizabeth Keckley bought her own freedom, and shortly after, the freedom of her son George. She repaid every loan. By the early 1860s, Elizabeth had relocated to Washington, D.C., building a dressmaking business that catered to the capital's political elite. Her clients eventually included the wives of senators, cabinet officials, and in 1861, Varina Davis, wife of Jefferson Davis, who would shortly become president of the Confederacy. But this was only the beginning. What came next reshaped the entire trajectory of her life. That same year, Elizabeth Keckley was introduced to Mary Todd Lincoln, who had just become First Lady. Mary Todd Lincoln needed a dressmaker capable of managing the enormous public pressure of dressing a First Lady during wartime. someone skilled, discreet, and reliable under the intense scrutiny of Washington society. Elizabeth Keckley got the position. She did not get it through connections or favor. She got it because her work was, by any objective measure, exceptional, and because the woman evaluating her had no patience for anything less. It was the highest possible ceiling available to a black businesswoman in Civil War-era Washington. A formerly enslaved woman, born with no legal right even to her own body, was now dressing the First Lady of the United States on a near-daily basis. What neither woman could have predicted was how far beyond a professional relationship this would grow, or how completely Elizabeth Keckley would come to occupy a role that no dressmaker before her had ever held inside the Lincoln White House. The relationship between Elizabeth Keckley and Mary Todd Lincoln evolved quickly from professional to something considerably closer. Mary Todd Lincoln was, by the accounts of nearly everyone who knew her, a difficult woman to be close to, volatile, frequently criticized in the press, prone to episodes of severe anxiety and grief that intensified as the war dragged on. She had few people around her she trusted completely. Elizabeth Keckley became one of them. Keckley was present in the White House for the most intimate and difficult moments of the Lincoln family's time there. She dressed Mary Todd Lincoln for state occasions. She was present during private family moments that few outside the household ever witnessed. And then, in February 1862, catastrophe struck. Willie Lincoln, the president's 11-year-old son, died of typhoid fever in the White House itself. The loss devastated both parents, but it broke Mary Todd Lincoln in a way from which those around her said she never fully recovered. She was, by multiple accounts, incapacitated by grief for an extended period, unable to attend her own son's funeral service, prone to extended periods of what contemporaries described as inconsolable despair. Standard household staff and the political apparatus around the Lincolns had no framework for managing what Mary Todd Lincoln was experiencing. Formal protocol offered nothing useful in the face of a mother's collapse. Elizabeth Keckley did. She sat with Mary Todd Lincoln through the worst of it. She managed the practical details of the household during a period when the First Lady could not. She became, by every account from those who observed the relationship, less an employee and more something closer to Mary Todd Lincoln's closest confidant in Washington. A role that crossed the deep social boundaries of race and class that defined nearly every other relationship in that household. This continued through the remainder of the war. Elizabeth Keckley was present in the Lincoln White House through some of the most consequential years in American history, trusted with details of the family's private grief and struggles that few others were permitted to witness. Then, on April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater. In the immediate aftermath, as Mary Todd Lincoln descended into a grief that observers described as nearly total psychological collapse, it was Elizabeth Keckley she asked for. Keckley came to her side within hours and remained close to her in the following days and weeks, as Mary Todd Lincoln, now a widow, facing an uncertain financial future and the loss of the position that had defined her identity for 4 years, tried to process what had happened. Of all the people available to the former First Lady in that moment, political allies, family members, the machinery of federal power itself, it was a formerly enslaved dressmaker she leaned on most heavily. That bond, formed across every conceivable social boundary of 19th century America, would define the next chapter of Elizabeth Keckley's life. It would also, eventually, destroy her public reputation entirely. In the years following the assassination, Mary Todd Lincoln's financial situation grew increasingly desperate. She had significant debts, diminished public sympathy, and few reliable sources of income. In 1867, she attempted to sell her old wardrobe and personal items in New York in an episode that became known as the Old Clothes Scandal, a public relations disaster that further damaged her already fragile reputation. Elizabeth Keckley, who had remained close to Mary Todd Lincoln throughout this period and had directly witnessed both the sale and the public backlash, decided to write an account of her years with the Lincoln family. Her stated purpose was to defend her friend, to give the public an honest, humanizing portrait of Mary Todd Lincoln from someone who had actually known her, rather than the caricature the press had constructed. In 1868, Elizabeth Keckley published Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. It was, in its main narrative, a remarkable historical document, one of the only first-hand accounts of the Lincoln White House written by a black woman, and a genuinely rare window into both the institution of slavery and the private life of the Lincoln family. But Keckley's publisher made a decision that transformed the book's reception entirely. Without her full understanding of the consequences, the published edition included an appendix of private letters written by Mary Todd Lincoln to Keckley. Letters that were personal, unguarded, and never intended for public consumption. The public reaction was immediate and severe. The letters were treated as a betrayal, a scandalous invasion of a grieving widow's privacy, regardless of Keckley's original intent. Mary Todd Lincoln, who felt genuinely and deeply wounded by the publication, ended the friendship permanently. The backlash against Elizabeth Keckley was disproportionate and lasting. Her dressmaking business, which had depended heavily on the patronage of Washington's elite social circles, collapsed as former clients distanced themselves from her. The book itself faced significant efforts at suppression. Accounts from the period describe attempts, including reported involvement from Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's surviving son, to buy up and destroy copies of the book to limit its circulation and protect the family's public image. Elizabeth Keckley, who had risked her entire professional reputation to defend a friend, was instead publicly ruined by the same act. Elizabeth Keckley spent her remaining decades in increasing obscurity. Her dressmaking business never recovered its former prominence. She taught for a time at Wilberforce University, worked in domestic and needlework roles, and lived out her final years in Washington, D.C., far removed from the proximity to power she had once held inside the Lincoln White House. In her final years, she resided at the National Home for Destitute Colored Women and Children, an institution she had years earlier helped to found and support. She died there in 1907, largely forgotten by the political world she had once moved through daily. For decades afterward, Elizabeth Keckley existed in the historical record primarily as a footnote to Mary Todd Lincoln's story, the dressmaker whose book had caused a scandal, rather than a historically significant figure in her own right. That framing has shifted substantially as historians have returned to behind the scenes in recent decades, recognizing it as an invaluable primary source. One of the few surviving accounts of both antebellum slavery and the private Lincoln household written from the perspective of a Black woman who lived through both. The book the establishment tried to bury turned out to be exactly what made her irreplaceable to history, an unflinching, first-hand witness to power, grief, and injustice that no official record could provide. She had been erased from comfort and status in her own lifetime. Her testimony was not. If this story stayed with you, you belong here. Subscribe and come back for the next one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and which part of this hit you hardest. I read every single one.